Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest Psych Health and Safety podcast live panel event. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the regular podcast. With me today, just for a few minutes, my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I'm well, Jason. I'm looking forward to this. It should be a really interesting panel. We've got some fantastic guests, and it's I think, a really important issue that we're looking at here. So it'll be good.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Hey, so I've got to say, it wasn't us who put the panel together today. It was actually one of our previous guests from our podcast from episode 39, which is 20 episodes ago, Joelle.
It's crazy. I can't believe we had that many episodes.
Yeah, so 59 episodes in now. So this will be episode 60 when it airs next week. But what I want to do is welcome in the lovely Desi Vlahos. How today, Desi?
Very well, thank you, Jason. Joelle, how are you?
Yeah, really good, thanks.
It's
Now,
good.
yeah, really, really great panel that you've put in, and you're going to introduce the panel shortly. But first of all, the topic title for today is Mental Health and Law, Time for a New Strategy. Why do you think that title is important? And I guess what are you trying to get out of the panel today, Desi?
Absolutely. Well, we know that the pressure of working, in the legal profession is not a new problem. Numerous studies have been conducted in Australia, also internationally, but particularly in the last 10 years, where we've seen an increase in the visibility and also the advocacy of people, which really has drawn attention to the high rates of psychological distress, of burnout, anxiety, depression, and also secondary stress and vicarious trauma. There's now an agreed recognition that these issues are not rare among legal professionals, but they're at high rates and they're driven by systemic factors within the profession itself. But on a really optimistic note, I think that the impact of COVID-19 has presented us with a real opportunity for change. I think it's shown us that the legal sector now has the capacity to adapt to change, and that from that we can see that good mental health is now way up the agenda and working practices are changing. And really ultimately what we're looking at getting out of the session is hoping to widen the focus, how certain aspects inherent in the practice of law and also within the associated business models, how they affect mental health at a systemic level. We're looking at challenging the status quo, and we're also looking at improving the culture in law. But ultimately, we're looking at challenging those accepted practices in the law that have been shown to consistently undermine mental wellbeing, and also inclusion in our profession, as we've seen. Additionally, we're looking at questioning the current strategy, which is clearly not working as effectively as it could be, so that people can ultimately flourish rather than leave the profession, end up disillusioned or end up unwell. And really, we're looking at doing this by, striving towards achieving and building the momentum for change, by acknowledging tonight where we are now and really how we can accelerate that progression. And I suppose really what am I after, Jace? We're wanting to be in a place where we can say that the law is a great place to work. It attracts, it retains a wide range of people. And I think that we have this, incredible opportunity right now to look at recalibrating work, to reconfigure it. So it's actually designed for this new way of work that we're finding ourselves in. So yeah, that's really what we're trying to achieve tonight.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're going to be prosecuting an argument that a new strategy is required, but it sounds like the timing might be right for the legal profession to hear this and start to take action.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, some people think that the pandemic, has been all doom and gloom, but, pandemics really, they shift completely, have the capacity to, reshape society at fundamental levels. So, and, what we've seen that, employers, I should say actually employees no longer want to be seen as simply workers or binary units, but they now want to be seen as complex human beings that are leading rich and full lives. So they're going to be looking going forward at what their employer can do to enrich their life experience. And I think that's really crucial in the consideration, especially when we know that in the legal profession, that good talent, is a challenge for a lot of organisations, and particularly brought about by a pandemic where there's been a real value shift as well. So yeah, absolutely going to be prosecuting the argument.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be a really good one. So just for our viewers who are on live, what we'll be doing is over the next hour, Desi will be moderating a discussion with 4 fantastic panelists. We will allow them to talk and raise some really good issues and hopefully ask some serious questions and have some serious discussion. And then for the last 20 or 30 minutes, we'll be opening it up for live Q&A. So if you're watching live on YouTube or on LinkedIn, feel free to drop in some comments. Interact with each other as well on the comments, and I'll be picking out some good ones and showing them. Joelle and I actually have a really easy day thanks to you, Desi. We get to just say hello at the beginning, and then we'll be ducking off, and you'll be doing the heavy lifting today. So I'll be in the background as well. So if you have any questions, I'll be interacting as Flourish DX on the YouTube channel as well, on the Flourish DX YouTube channel, that is. So Desi, we're going to get out of your hair, and we're going to allow you to introduce these amazing guests and have a really great discussion.
Too easy, Jason. Thanks, Joelle. All right. Well, let's get started then. Well, I'd like to start by introducing our guest panelists this evening. But in the interest of time, I will keep it brief. When I was reading through their extensive biographies and combined accomplishments, I realised it would probably take up half of the session. So joining us this evening, we have Lucy Brogden, who is the chair of the National Mental Health Commission and also the chair of the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance. How are you, Lucy?
Very well, Desi. Looking forward to the chat tonight.
So am I. Next, we have Fiona McClay. Hopefully she has just joined us. I will introduce her, and hopefully she will be with us very shortly. But Fiona's joining us as the Victorian Legal Services Commissioner and CEO of the Victorian Legal Services Board as our Victorian State Regulator, and you'll meet her very soon, hopefully. Next, we have Dr. Michelle Sharp. Michelle's been a practicing barrister since 2002. She's currently the convener of the Women Barristers Association. Michelle was also the founding member of the Victoria Bar Health and Wellbeing Committee in 2006. Nice to have you with us, Michelle.
Great to be here. Thanks very much.
Lovely. And lastly, joining us all the way from the UK, and we got him up nice and early today, we've got George Artley, who is the Bar Issues Commission Projects Lawyer at the International Bar Association. Great that you could join us nice and early, George.
Oh, it's not too early, Desi. Never too early to have these discussions. It's what gets me up in the morning, quite literally.
That's great to hear. Excellent. Good. Wonderful. Okay, well, I'd like to sort of caveat tonight's discussion with a couple of comments for those listening this evening. We acknowledge that our approach to bettering mental health situation in the legal profession requires a multidisciplinary approach. As legal professionals, we don't have all the answers, and this is why there's need for greater collaboration with other disciplines, with other industries and service models, as ultimately we all have a joint function to service our clients. So tonight we're going to have an open, a transparent conversation, noting that the views of the panelists are their own opinions, the analysis and experience of the current strategy and view to improvement for the future. So to kick things off then, to get started, I was going to do a lightning tour of each of our guests this evening, but seeing that we have the National Mental Health Commissioner with us on the panel, Lucy, I was hoping you might be able to speak to the National Mental Health Reform Agenda to set the tone. I know there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate about national and even international consistency with the terminology that we use so we can better help people to understand. Now, not knowing what the term refers to or having, preconceived ideas about, what it isn't, has been a real challenge in enabling, buy-in from all concerned. So when we're talking about mental health, Lucy, what exactly are we referring to?
Thanks, Desi. And what a great place to start, because mental health, I often go into a room and ask people how many people have mental health. And people will put up their hand and tell me all sorts of proportions. But the right answer is 100% of us have mental health. Where we are at in terms of our mental health sits along a continuum that can be well, coping, struggling, to experiencing mental illness. But mental health is the umbrella term that covers the well right through to the unwell. And it's important that we understand that concept and that 100% of us have mental health, and we will all have varying degrees of mental ill health at some point in our lifespan. So, focused on, in the Australian context, where we live, where we work, where we learn and where we play. And so we are working on building up the capacity in this context of our workplaces to provide psychological safety and mentally healthy workplaces for all our employees, whether that's in small business, our biggest business, whether it's in the professions, whether it's across any industry. Everyone's entitled to a psychologically safe workplace.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lucy. And look, I think it's really interesting as well that, a lot of people, they don't understand that good mental health is not just the absence of mental illness, but it is also that ability to lead a life of value. So, and on that note, then I suppose it means that, a health response, while it's critical, whilst, critical alone, it's not enough. So on that note, Lucy, then we can see that mental health really does stretch beyond the single system. So promoting good mental health really is the major responsibility shared by the community. And I suppose that really does apply to the whole legal ecosystem, where we tend to see a constant balancing act between service to the client and also to the court, advocacy and justice. That's traditionally been at the heart of the profession's collective understanding of its public role. I was going to ask Fiona this next question, but I might shoot to you, Michelle. I know you've been, at the bar since 2002. You're a long-standing advocate for better recognition, for normalisation and identification of wellbeing challenges facing lawyers. Would you say that there have been improvements in this perception within the profession? Do you think that we're on, a trajectory towards some conveyed optimism for change? Really, firstly, I suppose, sort of to go back a little bit, how have mental health problems generally been perceived? And then do you think that we are on that, trajectory towards some level of conveyed optimism for change?
I think we're on a trajectory. I'm not sure quite how far along we are. When I first set up or was responsible for founding the BAR's Health and Wellbeing Committee in 2006, there wasn't really a lot of research then at that time in Australia, and I was really being guided by a lot of the research then at that time in the US. And to me, it just made sense. The research made sense. It resonated with my own experiences, both at law school and in practice. But when I went to set up the very first CPD, very first seminar for my colleagues, I was horrified to find that people turned up really to heckle the psychologist. They thought it was, terribly bemusing. They thought, practice as a lawyer was a sort of special thing. Of course, it was inherently stressful, but that's what made them who they were, and made them sort of separate and distinct, dare I say, special from the rest of the population. And what I do see now, though, is there has been some movement, which is some cause for hope, in that now it's actually being discussed and it's actually being taken seriously. But I think one of the challenges is moving or pushing the debate further along, where the profession stops looking inward and starts taking into account lots of really useful research and learnings from from health professionals, from other people who are working in that space. Unfortunately, I think it's changing, but unfortunately there's been a tendency for barristers, and I say this with all love and affection, but sometimes there's a tendency to be very inward looking and to be not quite so trusting of the views of others. There's a sort of a sense of, well, to be a barrister is unique, and people who aren't barristers just can't possibly understand. I think the conversation that's beginning to be had is, well, we may be barristers, but shockingly, we're also human beings. And while there are some unique pressures in legal practice, our response to them is innately human, and that we have a lot to learn from other workplaces and other professions about, how to deal with that. So I think we need to start increasingly, and this is where there's my sort of frustration sometimes within the bar is really trying to push the conversation into, okay, let's look beyond ourselves. Let's look past our own nose and let's try and draw in the expertise from other people outside of the bar.
Excellent. No, that's something that really got me thinking. We do have Fiona with us now, so welcome, Fiona. Fiona, and just off the back of what Michelle was saying there, in terms of gaining understanding and expertise from other different industries as well. Being part of the Wellness for Law network, I recall you contributed a fantastic chapter in their publication, which highlighted the difficulty in driving tangible improvements in wellbeing across the legal profession compared with other industries. And in that chapter, you highlighted the health and safety outcomes for those in the mining industry, as an example, as having improved significantly over the last 30 years, but that the legal profession is experiencing, something quite different. So, really leading on from what Michelle was saying as well, if we haven't yet embraced a systemic approach to wellbeing, in your opinion, what do you think is holding us back? Do you think there's barriers in place that are impeding our progression? What did you discover from the Lawyer Wellbeing Project? And can you tell us a little bit about the recent workplace culture and wellbeing survey that the Victorian Legal Services Board has conducted?
Sure, thank you. And can you hear me okay?
We can.
Excellent. I'm sorry about the technological problems before. Look, I think it's not a secret to anyone here that there's been really negative perceptions of mental health or mental ill health, shall we say, in the profession. And I think, as Michelle was saying, this idea that if you're not really robust and tough, you're not cut out for a career in the law. You've got to be able to, to put up with it and to hack it. And that's been a significant barrier, I think, to addressing this issue. And I think, as Desi says, it hasn't been seen really as an occupational health and safety issue. It's really been sort of assumed to be part of being a lawyer. The research that Desi mentioned was undertaken by my office in 2019. We were very interested to understand in a bit more depth some of the drivers of wellbeing, and we did some qualitative research with a really fantastic and very generous group of around 30 to 40 lawyers. We did some deep dives and we had some very long, in-depth conversations with them. And so we found from that really 4 major findings, which I'm sure won't be a surprise to anyone. The people that we interviewed described being acculturated early in their career into a professional culture that frequently made it very difficult for the average person to achieve well-being. So it begins in law school. Someone recounted being in law school doing a dual degree, so law and I think arts, and a law professor standing up and saying, well, I'm not sure what else you people are studying, but let me tell you, in my class, you will work harder than in any other class. There'll be more things to read and there'll be more things to write. And very first day in law school, this expectation was set that this was going to be different. And then it continues on. It's competitive. People compete to get into law school, and then that continues on. And far too often people told us about really negative early career experiences, bullying, sexual harassment, being forced to work really long hours, and very limited training in interpersonal and coping skills to manage client relationships, and then often exposure to vicarious trauma. So this acculturation starts early and continues. The second thing we found was really a range of cultural and institutional factors that made it really hard to improve wellbeing of legal professionals. Again, accepting bullying and really poor management behaviour, and not very much training around being an effective manager of people. And both male and female interviewees identified a key problem as sexism and the dominance of what was described by one person as an alpha male culture, a very strong sense of that. I think, though, another key thing which did come through the research, which was encouraging, was that people were positive about the direction of change, particularly when we spoke to people who've been lawyers for a little while, and they felt that there had been some change, and in particular that the conversation around lawyer wellbeing was changing. It was something that could be discussed. And this research was done pre-COVID, and I think anecdotally we're seeing generally in the community that COVID has really helped us all be more open and honest about how we're feeling and about our mental health. So I hope that will continue on. The final thing that came through that work was lots of ideas for change that could improve wellbeing, counselling and debriefing programs, improved management training, and a focus on wellbeing in CPD. The final thing through that research that really struck me is that this is, if you like, one of those wicked problems. So every part of the legal and justice system plays a part in this, and perhaps paradoxically also they experience it. So junior lawyers are stressed because senior lawyers are stressed. Senior lawyers are stressed because the in-house lawyer at the business who's instructing them is stressed, or the government department official is stressed. They're stressed because their bosses are putting pressure on them to get things done, and so on and so on. So each part of the system also really needs to be working together, and that makes it much more complicated, but I think that's worth noting. Just finally, more recently, we did do, as Desi said, a short survey when lawyers renewed their practicing certificates between March and June this year, and we asked them about their workplace culture. We had about 900 lawyers who responded, and around 75% reported that overall their workplace culture had a more positive than negative impact on their wellbeing, which is great. And most often this was attributed to having supportive colleagues, flexible work arrangements, and reasonable work-life balance. Again, nothing shocking in that. And of course, the opposite to that, those that said that their workplace was negative, it was because they had unreasonable workloads, poor work-life balance, long work hours, a hypercritical culture, and a lack of collegiality. That was a really, really strong finding. So the other thing that came through that was that there's a more positive than negative impact on their wellbeing is correlated with age. So those in the younger age brackets are more likely than in older age brackets to indicate that their culture has a more negative than positive impact. So as you progress, you get happier. So we can hypothesize about why that might be. We are planning to use this survey next year as well, and over the coming years to track that and hopefully to see some change.
Fantastic, and look, I think that's an incredibly valuable tool that's going to be implemented and replicated in order to actually to monitor the state of the profession, particularly in Victoria as well. It's really interesting. A couple of things I drew out from what you said there, Fiona. You mentioned it, that it is a wicked problem, and George, I'm going to flip to you now. That exact term, I think we identified in the IBA in the wellbeing survey. So, I do want to go into the international perspective right now. As the Bar Issues Commission projects lawyer at the IBA, you've been involved in a wide range of projects in your role on issues affecting the future of legal profession. Most recently, you were tasked with leading a global project into the mental wellbeing of lawyers, which is about to be released any day now. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes. No, we're having our launch event on the 26th of this month. Yes, and our report will be coming out then. No, very much looking forward to it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. And, that's very exciting as a fellow IBA Wellbeing Task Force member. So tell me, George, what insights can you share with us in relation to the way mental health problems have been perceived within the legal profession internationally? Can you tell us a little bit about the project, what instigated it, and generally speaking, what were the key findings of the global evaluation? So, was it does it sound as though it's sort of similar to what Fiona was referring to, with the situation here in Victoria, and also with respect to the Life in the Law report that was just published out of Law Care? How do the results compare?
Yeah, well, I mean, in one sentence, the headline result is effectively that the international results mirror almost precisely the results of national surveys that have taken place in national studies, which is obviously fascinating in itself. In terms of the origins of the project, I mean, it really emerged out of a vacuum, in the sense that there was no global study that we could find on these issues, despite the fact that in many jurisdictions, US, UK and Ireland, Australia, there's been so much great work done over, well, in the case of the US, past few decades, I suppose, but in Australia and the UK in the past few years. And our former president was speaking to some of his colleagues at the American Bar Association, specifically about the ABA's focus on substance abuse, which I know is a major US focus in this area, about the need to have a kind of international perspective on this issue. And the project really began quite small. Our plan was to have a session, a large showcase session on this subject at our Miami conference, which was supposed to happen last year. Obviously, that was postponed. It's now happening next year. But once I and my colleague and boss Sarah, director of legal projects at the IBA, were tasked with this project, I mean, it soon became clear that there was such fertile ground for a much bigger piece of work on this than just putting together a showcase. And we were able to assemble a fantastic task force of international experts, of course, of which, Desi, you are a very valuable Australian member. And we decided that, I suppose in true International Bar Association fashion, the first thing to do would be a grand global survey, not just of individuals, but also of institutions. That also mirrored a successful project we'd done previously on bullying and sexual harassment in the legal profession. And so, yeah, really just wanted to go out there and get a global picture, fill in the blanks. And the data, once we got it back, once we'd had it analysed, as I said, very, very much mirrors the findings that we've seen in jurisdictional specific surveys, which means that our sort of overall, number one finding is this is a global problem. Jurisdictions, different firms in different parts of the world, different sections of the profession can't sort of really hide from this and say, that's just something that happens to lawyers in the English-speaking world, or we don't have those kinds of problems here. It is universal. But then in terms of the issues we're then facing is that the conversation about this subject is at such different stages in different parts of the world, and it also doesn't necessarily map onto maybe cultural, economic, or regional maps that you'd imagine. It is an advanced conversation that is easier to have in the English-speaking world. It's not a conversation that's very easily had in Europe, or even in Western Europe and some of the major economies, especially in the Mediterranean. Huge cultural barriers to discussing these sorts of issues. Very much seen again as a kind of an English-speaking world problem. We don't have those problems. So stigma is, I guess, the number two takeaway from this. That the real challenge is battling the stigma. And the challenge of dealing with this on a global level is how you sort of adapt your message to the different parts of the world where, again, perhaps in the UK, Australia, the US, it's broadly known and accepted that there's a cultural, business model problem here. You speak to senior people in the profession, they know that it's psychologically damaging to work in the law, but they either frankly don't care because they think, well, no one's forced you into the job. Or they think that it's essentially anathema to dismantle that model because it would destroy how they make money. Really, that is how the job works. You can't fiddle with it. And any firm that would try to do that, it would be unilateral nuclear disarmament. I mean, who's going to go first? Why would you? Whereas in other parts of the world, it really just about starting to have these conversations. Persuading people in firms that it's okay to even discuss mental health. Lucy was saying at the beginning, you go into a room of people and you say, who has mental health? We all do. That is not a conversation that comes easily, we're finding in certain parts of the world.
Absolutely. And I think that was a challenge, in the more intimate sort of group that we have happening within the Wellbeing Task Force that, we look at other jurisdictions and even, the first step is that cultural maturity, looking at, we need to meet, the lawyers in different jurisdictions with the language and the understanding they have at that instance. There were some compelling findings in the survey, George. You did mention stigma, but we also saw that something that Fiona also drew out as well, that wellbeing issues are having a disproportionate impact on intersectionality groups, and that there was a large disparity also between the number of institutions that say they have wellbeing initiatives in place and the small amount of those in managerial positions actually being offered any sort of wellbeing training. And I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But what we can see is that, there is some momentum. There's growing awareness of the importance of mental health and wellbeing within the profession. And we're beginning to see not just simply talk, but some clear steps now towards work environments where people feel as though they're safe to have appropriate mechanisms of support in times of psychological distress. So, Lucy, on a similar vein, Fiona was talking a little bit about, driving the difficulty in the legal profession in driving tangible improvements, and the fact that the health and safety outcomes for those, say, in the mining industry, as an example, is having improved significantly comparatively to, the professional, scientific and technical sector. And at a recent conference that I spoke at, I noticed that the Safe Work Mentally Healthy Workplaces New South Wales benchmarking tool placed the professional, scientific and technical sector, of which the legal profession is included, as the worst performing sector and also well below the average. So from that, and probably can shed a bit more light on this, but that meant that sector was only meeting the basic awareness benchmark, where organisations view mental health as an individual's responsibility. So they might have general workplace health and safety systems, policies and processes. So as the chair of the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance and your advisory capacity on the Corporate Mental Health Alliance Australia, I understand you work with a number of corporates. Can you share some thought about why you think it is that the professional, scientific and technical sector, of which the legal sector, is part of, might not be performing very well?
Oh, Desi, that's a nice big question, and there's many elements to it. But you're right, and I think one of the things we've hypothesised is that manufacturing, industrial sectors, etc., and I think George has touched on this, and Michelle touched on this, have had a tradition of that they've had to focus on physical safety for a long time. So the adjacent step to move to psychological safety, culturally, systems-wise, has not been as big a step. But I can still go into professional services firms that I'm not going to say they're unaware of their obligations, but they're very naive around what their obligations might be. And some even joke and mock around the obligations in that place. And I think Michelle touched on some of this and the cynicism of it. So there's been a big focus on educating professional services firms and the sector around their obligations, and then actually helping them with the what and how to address some of these particular issues. And it intrigues me, going back to some of the earlier comments, that a profession that is so dependent on evidence can turn a blind eye to the good evidence in this space. And I'm not sure why that is, but we actually have some of the best academics working in this country on this particular issue, publishing widely, very accessible, and yet when I speak to people in professional services, they're very dismissive of that work, and I'm not sure what's going on, but it is a challenge for all of us. I am encouraged by the fact that a number of the big law firms have signed up to the Corporate Mental Health Alliance and really recognise that they don't know what they don't know in this space and are so willing to learn and share. And so I think that's the great opportunity for all of us in that regard.
And I think that's a really important point that you make, that, it's going to come down to, to education for, these corporates to learn from each other. And I suppose there's another question I'm going to ask you a little bit later, just around something that we've mused over in our discussions, even with the International Bar Association Task Force, about this theory of a level of exceptionalism in the legal profession. So you rightly said that with respect to evidence, it's also that lawyers are also very risk averse, and yet when it comes to psychological health and safety, there tends to be a little bit of probably I suppose the word would be a non-recognition or a inability to address it adequately. Tell me, Michelle.
Well, I think, Desi, sorry if I can just add to that, Desi. I think there's something else going on that we really need to understand a little bit more, and it's a bit of a survivor phenomenon. But what we found is, you talk to the young lawyers; they're very altruistic about the profession that they want to be a part of. But then there's a bit of a survivor mentality when we talk to the senior partners, that they were full of an energy for change, and then when they got to the top, they've lost that. And when you talk to them, they kind of go, well, if I've survived it, anyone can survive. And they almost wear that as a badge of honour. And we need to change, I think, that mentality to say, actually, this has been really trauma-inducing. It's not character building. In fact, it's the opposite. And I know talking with Liz Broderick, when she was looking at gender challenges within defence, it was often the senior women that were the hardest nuts to crack in the cultural change piece. And I suspect some of this work needs to focus on some of our senior lawyers to say, you really did suffer a bad system. Let's not perpetuate that. Let's be part of that change.
Absolutely. No, and that's right. And we've also put it on the table whether you think perhaps sort of off the back of what you're saying there, Lucy, that the current business model, does drive that sense of legal exceptionalism from a cultural perspective. Do you think that sort of social identity theory sort of plays into that to some extent?
I'm a big fan. I think social identity plays a really big part. And in some work that I did a few years ago, it was quite heartbreaking, actually, when we asked lawyers right across the profession to list 8 identities. And our most distressed lawyers had 8 identities just in the law alone. And sadly, a lot of them identified things like breadwinner, which is not a positive identity to hold. It's a very burdened identity to share. And I think, again, Michelle and Fiona touched on some of this. Our young lawyers come in bringing so much to the profession, so much more than just being bright young things. And yet what we see that within 5 years, their work has actually made it really hard to maintain that breadth of identity. And they're not playing sport anymore or as much. They're not engaged in community efforts. They're not pursuing hobbies and life outside the law. And that is not healthy. And so I think these are the strategies that we need to look at, is how do we allow people to be their whole person for their whole career across the law.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more there, Lucy. Tell me, Michelle, so just in the interest of time as well, tell us what's been happening at the bar. I mean, you're involved in setting up the Health and Wellbeing portal. You've been coordinating some really informative CPD sessions addressing mental health and wellbeing over the last 18 months. There was a quality of life survey launched in 2018 at Vic Bar, and more recently I hear that there's a revised code of conduct that's been released at Vic Bar. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think you might be on mute, Michelle.
Sorry, first century problem. Can I also just pick up on something that Lucy has said? I think Lucy's really got her finger on the issue when she says there's this sort of badge of honour that is sort of going on in the law. And so you sort of still see it in the profession where to complain that you're stressed, to complain that you're overworked, to complain that you're working long hours is almost, sort of a badge of honour that, you're doing so well that, you're essentially sort of suffering. And this idea of identity. So one of the things I found really quite, so particularly in the sort of early years of trying to raise this issue, is not only this issue of stigma that people were afraid if they were talking about mental health issues, they were seen as perhaps not being fit lawyers, which is, all the research points to that certainly is the case. But also I think there are a lot of lawyers, or certainly a lot of barristers, who were wedded to a particular idea of what a barrister was. And the idea of poor mental health just didn't fit with that. And they were really heavily invested. And it took me a while, probably longer than I would like to admit, to kind of wake up to the idea that when I was talking about these issues, part of the reason why people were becoming quite defensive and upset was because they'd invested a lot of time fighting to get into law school, get through law school to be where they are, that they had invested in heavily in this idea of themselves as barristers, and there was a particular persona that went with that was incompatible with this idea of perhaps at times not coping as well as they think they ought to. This idea of this tough rumple of the bailey, gladiatorial lawyer is not a lawyer that they saw as being compatible with somebody who talked about issues of mental health. So a lot of what I've been doing in particular at the bar, and particularly with COVID, is putting on a lot of CPDs. In fact, Desi, we had you along to one that was particularly successful. So and a lot of it is really about having that conversation, normalising that conversation about mental health, and for a lot of barristers. And particularly friends I speak to individually, and particularly during a time in COVID, have been, expressing how difficult they are in terms of coping, and how they think maybe that means they're not cut out to be a lawyer, maybe they should leave the profession. And so having seminars where these ideas are being talked about, at least initially, just helps a lot of those barristers, or a lot of those lawyers who are sort of suffering in their own little bubble, to realise that they're not alone, that these are very common, these are very, common experiences. Of course, prior to COVID, there's been, during COVID, there was the launch of the portal. That's still a work in process, but the idea behind that is to try to have a sort of a website in which a lot of resources are available on tap for barristers, and also hopefully in time, much like what you see particularly in websites in overseas in America. I think Dallas Bar in particular has been very good at this, and that is having stories, having lawyers tell their own stories about, managing their mental health, or, recovering from a period of poor mental health. And sometimes before COVID, there was the Victorian Bar Victorian Bar Quality of Life Survey, and again, picking up what George has said, and of course, in one of your CPDs, Desi, for the bar, the results of that are, remarkably similar. You see the same patterns, which again, to pick up on something George was saying, is that when the Health and Wellbeing Committee was being established, and I was looking at the US studies, in fact, that was the very thing somebody said to me at the Victorian Bar. They said, those are American lawyers. They do it differently. They're educated differently. It's a whole other thing. We're not like that. And then then I had a good laugh, and dare I say, an almost told you so moment when the Brain Mind Foundation national survey came out, and would you believe it? It really closely mirrored a lot of what was coming out in the US. And so I think that just sort of goes to show that this is very much a profession problem, and I suppose we can look at a number of reasons why, like the people who are drawn to law, how we're trained to think like barristers, lawyers in our law courses, in law school, and then what the legal culture sort of then does. But it's remarkable, and at the same time kind of terrifying, that you see the same issues and you see the same patterns coming up.
Absolutely, and that's the thing with a lot of the surveys that we've conducted. We are seeing very similar results. We've spoken about stress in the legal profession, and ad infinitum, and replicated the surveys. We've acknowledged the way that laws being practiced can be stressful. But I sort of wanted just to hone in on something now. More recently, we're starting to talk about something called psychosocial hazards at work. And we know there's a number of risk factors and protective factors that Lucy referred to earlier as well, that may contribute to the level of mental health in the workplace. Really, you know, and Lucy, I wanted to sort of ask you this question. I mean, I understand that the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance are currently developing the National Workplace Initiative. We hear the term mentally healthy workplace really often. Can you talk us through what's meant by a mentally healthy workplace in that context? And then really just tell us what we're talking about when we're referring to psychosocial hazards.
You don't ask the little questions, do you, Desi? And all in 5 minutes. So in terms of the work that the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance is focused on, is actually trying to lift the bar beyond compliance. Now, we've already recognised that various industries are at various levels in their capacity for compliance with our workplace health and safety legislation, and the other 20 pieces of legislation across the country that impact on employee wellbeing, whether that's discrimination policies, whether it's carer policies, whatever it might be. There's about 20 pieces, so the lawyers keep very busy. Once we get above compliance, we're looking at mentally healthy workplaces where people can thrive and be psychologically safe. We've got a code out in New South Wales, but other jurisdictions are following suit around trying to actually identify and articulate what those psychosocial hazards might be, taking what we know from the science and putting that into a practical framework for people to assess risk in their organisations around things like span of control, around the issues of culture within the organisation, around safety from things like discrimination, bullying, harassment, etc. I think the challenge is going to be, and you guys are the lawyers, but the challenge is that often the issues and the hazards in physical safety are universal. You know, a heavy object falling on someone's foot is going to have the same impact universally. But what we actually know around some of the psychosocial risk factors is that the impact on me will be quite different. There's an individual lens often through some of these factors. And so it's understanding the commonality and universal components of these hazards, but also the individual impact on them. Now, we've seen some of that in the discrimination and harassment space where people have a different tolerance to some of these issues. But it is important, and I think it's going to be an industry by industry and even sub-industry approach to some of this to recognise how those hazards manifest within your organisation and how they can be mitigated and managed going forward.
Excellent. So, I mean, I suppose from the surveys then, George, off the back of what Lucy was just saying then, what can we identify as some of the main psychosocial hazards that commonly affect lawyers then? In sort of brief format.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, so one of the questions we asked was, you know, which of the following hazards, I guess we'll call them here, have you experienced most frequently? And I guess not surprisingly, you know, number one was this idea of competing demands. So, you know, it's the kind of job where you need to be doing 4 things at once. Now that happens in other jobs, I'm sure, but perhaps not to the same extent, followed by long hours, unrealistic time pressures, inability to take breaks, having to neglect tasks, you know, lack of control over your workload, lack of feedback, all feed into this idea that, you know, essentially it's, you know, what's the major sort of trigger for anxiety and issues? You know, it's feeling you're not in control. You're not in control of what you're doing. I know certainly that was something I experienced when I was a trainee solicitor. You know, this sense that, you know, I'm working really hard on this task now, but at any moment, if a partner puts their head around the door and says, we need this done, you've got to do it. And there's nothing you can say about it. You know, if you put your hand up and say, well, I can't, well, you know, you're for the chop, basically. It's a dog-eat-dog world. We also saw, and this reflected something we'd seen in our previous studies, you know, there is harassment and bullying. It's probably experienced far less often than those more common factors, but what we also saw was when it is experienced, it has the most detrimental impact, perhaps not surprisingly, on people's well-being, mental well-being. I was thinking earlier on, Desi, I mean, you asked at the very beginning of this, what does you know, mental health and mental well-being mean to you? And it was great to hear whatever people had to say. And you know, I sort of repeat what they say. And I mean, the way I think about it is that, you know, in our lives there is inevitable and unavoidable suffering and stress, and it's a bit like background radiation. And, good mental health is the ability to kind of cope with that, to overcome and to rationalize that suffering and stress and get on and leading a healthy and happy life. I think what we're doing with lawyers, essentially, and what we found in our reports is, when it comes to radiation, we're like, the firefighters who went to Chernobyl. They're the people there working on the kind of exposed nuclear reactor. And then, we're surprised then when they're so damaged. So I think, yes, we know what these issues are, but like I say, so many of them are just seen as inevitable, byproducts of the job and the business model, and that's what we need to tackle.
And that's exactly right. So, and that's what it is. It's about tackling that business model, really deconstructing it, and taking this opportunity now as a way forward, and reformulating that, and identifying the hazards. So, Fiona, how have these hazards traditionally been managed within the legal profession? I mean, if we recognise that prevention beats cure, what's been the default response in the legal profession? Do you think it's been one of prevention from the outset? Or do you think there's a bit of a tendency for firms and organisations to be a bit more reactive in their approach? Sort of what George was saying, considering stress in the workplace is something that is part and parcel of the legal profession, and will support you through building your resilience, or through self-care, or responding to issues through just access to EAP or mental health first aid after the fact. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think yes, I agree. In short, I agree. I just was reflecting, listening to Lucy and to George. One of the things that I think I spent a lot of time thinking about is the nature of lawyers themselves. And I do think that also is a factor in this issue. So when we did our legal wellbeing project, we identified what we call horizontal pressure, which is really about competition amongst your peers. We talked about vertical pressure, which is what I mentioned before with bosses and clients and so on. And then this third one was internal pressure, we called it. And some of that comes down to perfectionism and self-criticism, which are very strong traits in lawyers, and again are really honed through law school and then in your early career as a lawyer. So if you come into the law, as people often do with those characteristics, they are really finely tuned by the time you're kind of a fifth year lawyer. And I think that means that there's a lot of expectation lawyers place on themselves to do things that are, really unreasonable. I think something that also sometimes goes along with that, and picking up on your comment, Lucy, before, which very astute, why is it that lawyers who rely on evidence are so dismissive of evidence in this space? I think lawyers are often dismissive of expertise in other disciplines, actually. When I worked in a law firm a long time ago, I often worked with the marketing people, for example, and the comms team. I was very interested in what they did, and I could see they had a specific expertise and skill set that I didn't have. But I can tell you that not a lot of my colleagues shared that respect for that skill set. And I think that is true even in relation to research on wellbeing. The other thing about lawyers is that they're trained to pick holes in evidence, actually. So yes, they want evidence, but they're always looking for the gaps in it, and that's their default response. So I think there is, a conversation with lawyers about lawyering and being a lawyer, which is really important here. Something else I think to pick up on, listening to you, George, reflecting on the global work, there is the reality of the practice of law, and then there's also the mythology that sits around it. And the two things are very closely connected. Myths often come out of some essential truth. But I do think that there are opportunities there to help, particularly, again, younger lawyers, be able to push back in a way that, to tell them that they don't have to just accept unreasonable conduct. And sometimes that may not go well, and you might be on the receiving end of a mouthful from a senior lawyer, but other times it does actually, it's fine. And the more senior person will say, oh, I'm really sorry, I didn't realise, let's talk about that. So that's something that I always talk about when I come and speak to the younger lawyers at Leo Cusson. I talk to them about that. I share with them an experience I had as a very young lawyer, a long way out from the centre of town where the office was, and having a conversation actually in a way quite naively at the time, and just saying, the last train leaves at 6:39. If I miss that train, I've got an hour to wait till the next one, so I really need to leave the office at 6:30. And that was how I couched it, and to the credit of the lawyer I worked for, he said, well, that's perfectly reasonable. So there are actually ways to do it, and I think there is an opportunity and really a role for those of us that have been around for a bit longer to help to challenge some of those stereotypes that just are so negative and so destructive, because it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
Excellent. So do we think I might just sort of put it to the panel then, do we think then that there is a tendency, so obviously we've got, these the personality traits that attract a lot of lawyers to the practice of law as well. But additionally, there are other things as well. There's the environment, there's the culture as well that plays a big part as well. So do we think, generally speaking, do we think then that there is a tendency for firms to be reactive in their approach? Is that sort of just what we think, that it's more a reactive approach rather than a preventative approach? Michelle?
If I can jump in, I think absolutely reactive, and at times even with a dash of short-term memory. And so there has been, for example, at the Victorian Bar, during the time I've been working on health and wellbeing, there've been two separate suicides, or known suicides. There might have been other people who passed, but there've been two instances I can recall where there has certainly been suicides. And so I've been sort of fighting for funds or to do something, and in the wake of that, I'll get funds and we'll be able to do something. And then I think, well, this a new age is dawning. This is it. And then people will forget. You have the same conversations and you have the same sort of fight. So I think it is very reactive, and maybe it's tied to something I think Fiona has picked up on, which I think is still very much a real issue and a challenge, and that is the sort of the blind spot and the pressures that lawyers put on themselves. So I know there's that. So, for example, Susan Dagoff, who writes "Lawyer, Know Thyself," and she talks about the lawyer personality. So there is this bit of sort of chicken and the egg, do you make lawyers, or are they born and finally honed? And who really knows? But certainly that's a challenge in terms of self-awareness for lawyers and for doing what they need to do to maintain their own good health. But also, as you pointed out, there's also that institutional requirement as well, and so I think a really great example and very tragic example of this is Kazaroff and the state of Victoria, which was handed down in February last year, and that was a case of a lawyer who a solicitor in the OPP who was working in a unit dedicated to child sex offences, and she was doing a high volume of cases, had quite a heavy caseload, and became incredibly sick with serious vicarious trauma, severe depression, and so the OPP we have an EAP program, we have these kinds of policies. And it's sort of, being put to this particular lawyer, well, why didn't you speak up? And so there's some really great evidence there about how this sort of professional identity, and again, harking back to what Lucy was saying, this identity of being a dedicated professional and a sort of serious lawyer, where this particular lawyer would sort of disassociate from her own pain. And part of that disassociation is kind of what you learn in law school. I mean, you in law school, you're not encouraged at all to look at the interpersonal relationships in a legal problem. You are really encouraged to put that to one side, to put the emotions one side, and really to rationalise from rights and obligations and a legal problem. So you're taught very early on to sort of disassociate. And so that's perfectionism, pessimism, and this kind of ability to disassociate then creates a kind of perfect storm. So the point that Georgia is raising about all of these external pressures is very present, probably at much higher levels in the legal profession. But what makes it particularly bad is you do see those kinds of pressures in other workplaces, but you don't see the same high levels of poor mental health. And part of the reason is the issues that Fiona and Lucy are talking about in terms of the external pressures that does create this kind of sort of perfect storm. So I think the lesson out of Kazarov is that even if you've got this, dedicated lawyer who feels passionately and empathises with the victims, wants to be promoted up, and is saying, no, I'm fine, don't take me out, is that you do need institutions that will actually step in to protect those people and say, no, we're gonna give you a respite from that, and we're going to rotate you out to something else. So I think Kazarov is should be photocopied and sent to multiple firms, because there are some really terrific research that's referred to in that, and some really terrific lessons. I mean, tragic situation, but it really illustrates, I think, perfectly everything that we're talking about tonight.
Desi, can I just add to that? Because I think, and George, I'll be interested in your thoughts, but one of the things we've seen in some of the analysis we've done is that some of these phenomenons, and I've probably got the term wrong, but are really manifesting in those countries that have got a British-based legal system, and we don't see it so much in the codified countries, and I think that's an interesting thing to look at. But what, in talking to colleagues in Europe, one of the things they've identified is that here in Australia, across all our states, which is basically how you get into law school, it's the best and the brightest. Literally, the top marks go into medicine or law. And interviewing, the medical profession is getting much better at selecting students, even at that level, with an aptitude for medicine. And I do some of the interviews at one of our universities for these young medical students. And we say to them, so if you don't get into medical school, what are you going to do? Oh, law. And, that's not a choice. Like, that's not necessarily the right choice or a good choice. And I'm just wondering if in some of these things that you're talking about, we actually need to be better at guiding some of the young people that maybe law is not for everyone. And there are paths, in studying elements of the law that don't set you up to be a lawyer if you're not cut out for it. Because what we see too is that once you're in it, it's very hard to get out of. You are quite entrapped by the trappings of being a lawyer. And I think that's stepping back just one step further, Michelle, from what you're talking about.
I think so many things you've raised there, Lucy, that would be great to slightly unpack. And I think it might relate even to some of the questions I know that are in the chat that we're meant to be answering. But in terms of that, the common law, civil law divide, yes, we did see in our global survey higher or lower wellbeing index scores in those common law countries versus the civil law ones. Now, why that is the big question. Is it, sort of a bias, the fact that we know that in a lot of civil law countries, English-speaking world, people are more open about these issues, so they sort of click the lower button. Is it because the common law system is more adversarial and therefore it's that bit more brutal? Or is it, and I think that's a really fascinating point, is, in the English-speaking world countries, law is, the prestige profession along with medicine, as you say. And we know that in, say, France or Germany or other countries, it might be engineering or something like that. And it'd be fascinating to see the comparisons to those professions in those countries to see whether or not we're seeing similar levels of well-being attrition. The comparison with the medical world is an excellent one as well. And it also feeds into what Michelle was saying about the kind of, you've got the external risks of the legal profession, but also the internal, weakness is the wrong word, but predisposition to suffering, perhaps, of the people who go into those professions. Now, the medical profession, certainly in the UK, has taken big steps to try and deal with that. You know, the transformation in terms of working hours that junior doctors are allowed to do has transformed the profession in the past 10 to 15 years. Fascinatingly, you know, similar attempts were made to do the same thing in the legal profession or in sort of city-based jobs. You know, there was a working time directive that was brought in. It was a piece of EU legislation. Of course, lawyers in the City of London lobbied the government to get an exemption for the UK for that, because it was seen as, again, being anathema to their business model. And the first thing I did as a trainee solicitor in a city firm was sign a piece of paper saying, I know that I have this legal right not to work this many hours, but I also recognise that it's incompatible with my ability to serve clients to do that. Therefore, I waive my rights under it. So that also illustrates to me that kind of very delicate and vital interplay between the cultural shifts we need in attitude and also the kind of hard legislation, because you need both to fix this. But you can't just have one, though, because if you don't have the cultural shift, then they will find workarounds to the hard legislation and vice versa.
Could I just jump in here, Desi?
Everybody wants to. We'll go for Fiona first, perhaps.
I just wanted to, again, picking up on Lucy and George, one of the things that we are trying to do in my office as the regulator is move the perception of what it means to be a good lawyer, so that it's not just about technical competency. And that's important to us in all aspects of regulation. We don't want to be arguing with lawyers about how close to the wind they can sail. There's a lot of really interesting discussion and analysis coming out of the various Royal Commissions over the last few years, the Banking Royal Commission, the Royal Commission into institutional child sexual abuse, and this theme of not can I, but should I? And this is a conversation that we are increasingly having with lawyers in Victoria to think about that. Is not just can I do this legally, but should I do this? And I think it's relevant also to this area of mental well-being, because if your focus is only about technical expertise and how finely you can parse the relevant legal principle, then anything else is just extrapolated, is extraneous to that. And we're really wanting to build well-being into a critical part of practice. Another way we're trying to do that is through CPD. So lawyers have to do 10 hours a year, and one of those hours is the ethics unit. And it's notoriously underappreciated, let's say, by lawyers. Lawyers find it difficult, they say, to get that 1 hour of ethics input. And there's a bit of a vicious circle that's built up where lawyers don't really like it, they're reluctant to do it, and so there's not a market to provide good quality ethics CPD, and so the spiral goes. But part of the problem, again, is that it's often presented as a very dry technical discussion about a particular case or all the different examples of a rule and how closely a lawyer got to the rule or not, rather than it being a discussion about what it means to be a good lawyer, what it means to take your place in society, your role in upholding the rule of law, contributing to the administration of justice, all of those things that actually can shift the focus of a lawyer away from the day-to-day and ground them in a bigger picture, which in itself can be protective in terms of people's mental health. So that's, as I say, a conversation that we're increasingly having and trying to spread that across all aspects of the way we engage with the lawyers that we regulate.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll go ahead, Michelle, and then we'll move on to questions.
No, I would sort of emphasise that the point Fiona is making, and that is sort of reevaluate what it is to be a good lawyer. So George, I mean, you're talking about working those hours to sort of serve the client. I think where the sort of wellbeing movement, if we can call it that, is moving to. Is a recognition that the sorts of skills we need to develop in order to enjoy good mental health are really useful skills in legal practice. So I think one of the hallmarks of good mental health is the ability to experience good, bad emotion and be able to understand it and process it. And so I think that's a sort of outside of analysis of the law, legal practice it's a very useful sort of skill set to have. Not only does that make you more resilient and sustainable in terms of your legal practice, but it enables you to better empathise with your clients, better communicate with your clients. And I think, parallel to this wellbeing movement that is coincidentally or unintentionally helping to sort of shift the debate is the alternative dispute resolution, which relies on sort of skill sets that were once thought to be sort of crazy and innovative and very touchy-feely. For example, skills as active listening, which requires a certain amount of self-awareness in order to be able to develop a rapport with someone else. So, in a way, I think, I guess to pick up on some of the optimism, Desi, that you were talking about earlier, I think, while it's easy to kind of feel a sense of doom and gloom when we look at these sort of statistics, equally, I think it provides a really exciting opportunity to reevaluate what it is to be like, to kind of evaluate what are the sorts of skills that are really useful in terms of administration of justice, because I think they are actually, surprisingly, are more aligned with good mental health than this kind of badge of honour sort of bad mental health. And again, and I think this is helping Desi sort of segue to question one. We can see it in such things as, for example, sexual harassment and and bullying, those kinds of things as well.
Absolutely. So off the back of then what you're saying then, Michelle, there, and I had all these intentions of sort of raising, the value shift and the move towards, equality, diversity and inclusion and ESG agendas. We'll have to sort of park that for the time being. But look, one of the questions that's come in is how do you think about the systemic global issues in the profession? So, that is, bullying, sexual harassment, mental ill health are best tackled. Who wants to have a go at that one?
I'd love to have a go at that one. This has been something I've been working on really since I commenced my time in this role almost 4 years ago. I really wanted to have some good evidence, picking up on Lucy's comments before. And so we did a survey of the entire profession in 2019 in Victoria, and found, unsurprisingly, that sexual harassment is widespread in the Victorian legal profession, and that it particularly affects women. So women in the legal profession in Victoria experience much higher rates of sexual harassment than the Australian Human Rights Commission found was the case for women in all Australian workplaces. So 61% of women in the Victorian profession said they had experienced sexual harassment. And for many of them, that was in the last 5 years. So this is not sort of historic. It was also much more likely to happen to younger women, and it was almost always perpetrated by older men who were in positions of power and authority over them. They were really concerning findings, and some of it goes a long way to underpinning what we're talking about today. The reasons why, again, are well known to us. It's very male dominated, the legal profession. It's hierarchical. It's team-based often. There's a culture of using alcohol and drugs to celebrate success and to manage disappointment in the profession, which is unhealthy and contributes to this. So sexual harassment is a big problem for the profession in terms of mental health. In terms of how to respond to it, it has to be something that the whole profession from top to bottom embraces. And look, I am encouraged at the moment in Victoria. We have made this a regulatory focus. We've been explicit that sexual harassment is an issue of fitness. It can be a breach of the conduct rules. We will investigate complaints, and we will see those through. And we have got some complaints underway. We've been talking as well about the bystander effect and people being willing to stand up. We've launched an online anonymous reporting portal where people can tell their story in safety and confidence. But also, pleasingly, across the profession, we're seeing things happen. So now to be appointed as a silk in Victoria, it's one of the things that's taken into account. Similarly, judicial appointments. What sort of character does this person have? And that could include a consideration of whether or not there are findings of sexual harassment in relation to that person. The Law Institute and the Bar have both been really doing a great job. The Law Institute's recently issued a statement inviting people to sign up, tools, all sorts of things being developed. So again, perhaps I'm too optimistic, but I do think at the moment there is lots of things all heading in the right direction, at least in Victoria.
Fiona, that's so encouraging to hear all of that. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of this. In the past, I think we've traditionally tried to solve each issue as it arises with the individuals. And that's important to support the individuals. But we never then lift up to say, what's the systemic thing that's going on? And that's where we need that focus. It's just too easy, and it's the wrong place to start by focusing on the individuals to think that doing that will fix the whole system. So that's so encouraging.
And that's probably been the default as well, Lucy, that, it has been the focus, that knee-jerk reaction to focus on the individual, to think that, these, or refer it to, as a self-care issue, and that the profession will support you. And I think that's been a real challenge. And I suppose that what you were saying there as well, Fiona, is, that there is a connection, and a strong connection between poor workplace culture and wellbeing and conduct issues. And I think that the Brain and Mind Research Institute report, the Courting the Blues report, really drew that out. And I think it was even suggested that approximately 80% of disciplinary matters had an underlying mental health issue at their core, which is quite staggering data, really, when you think about that. So, so definitely. George, did you want to sort of add to that as well, before we move to the next question?
Well, just very quick. I mean, fascinating to hear everyone saying, as usual. Obviously, it's an incredibly hierarchical profession in so many ways. So you need to really get the people at the top. You need to start at the top with a lot of this stuff, and certainly the sort of the chinks of light that we're currently seeing with our work at the IBA is in our conversations, or getting people on board with conversations, certainly at regulators. Again, that kind of hard, codes of conduct, that kind of thing. Particularly when you look at what some regulators are doing to junior members of the profession who are, kind of being tarred and feathered for mistakes they're making, or because of, the toxic workplace culture. Terrible stories almost on a weekly basis in the Law Society Gazette of juniors who, did something bad with an email or left a file on a train, who are just being kicked out of the profession very brutally. And instead of actually having that kind of internal conversation about why that's happening, the profession seems to be saying, well, we just banish these people as heretics, and that needs to change. Also, fascinating conversations with the senior general counsel, people who left, firms and are now working in-house in places, who with their kind of small teams that they have control over, introduce completely new working practices along, positive wellbeing lines, and saw fantastic increases in productivity and wellbeing and health. And them then being able to say to firms that they're instructing, unless you adopt that working culture, we won't instruct you. And that's where it's going to hit, certainly big corporate firms, it hit them in the pocket. Where did the billable hour come from originally? It was clients demanded it 20 or 30 years ago. If the clients turn around and say, we don't want that anymore, and we want you to work in a different way, otherwise we won't pay you, that's kind of where I think the big change is probably going to happen.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Was that you, Michelle? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to, so following on from George and Fiona, so at the Victorian Bar, we've launched a new code of conduct that was launched, I think, last week. As part of that now, it is a requirement for an application for Silk to attend a seminar dealing with issues and leadership. The Women Barristers Association is consulted about appointments, judicial appointments, and also Silk. So a member of our bar, will consult on that. Jenny Pachuni QC is our go-to person at the moment. She liaises with the Chief Justice, talking about sort of any issues that come up within the organisation dealing with bullying or sexual harassment. Also, as part of the code of conduct, now the Victorian Bar is putting together a group of support people for those who do make complaints as well, to assist those people and provide them with support when they make complaints. So there is some good stuff happening in this space at the moment.
Absolutely. I suppose when you've got, you don't have that organisational institution context, so what supports are available, and that code of conduct, hopefully will see some form of guidance for members of the profession as well. There's another question that's come through here. It's does the panel have any reflections on what other logistically sound methods of research, or other than surveys, can be used to assess mental health in the law? And presumably what that might refer to is to assessing psychosocial risk in the workplace. I suppose I might shoot to you there, Lucy. What can an organisation do? I mean, if they're wanting to show their commitment, they've got a good risk register, but they don't really know what to do in relation to psychosocial risk. What would you recommend an organisation to do from the outset?
Desi, I love these little questions you're just flicking my way.
Calling together, Lucy. Yeah.
Look, there's quite a few things. One is that I think organisations often forget the goldmine of data they're sitting on already at any given time, and to just start using the data that they have around, turnover of staff down at that team level. Who's got big turnover? Who's got a good, solid, consistent team? Absentee data will give you some good insights. Productivity data will give you some good insights. Complaints data, if you're tracking it, are all things that will give you some good indicators. We're not asking people to manage the mental health of any individual within their organisation. We're asking them to create that psychologically safe environment for people to work, and a safe environment where if someone is struggling, they can put up their hand and know that they'll be supported when they do. Outside of that, there are great tools and services. People at Work tool, which has been developed by the regulators, Safe Work, etc., is freely available for people to self-assess their team, their organisation against, and has some great supports that come with that. There's great free resources around job and work design out of the Centre for Transformative Work Design in WA and others out there. So I think it's really a matter of looking and talking to your in-house experts that we know are not always recognised in law firms, but most of those larger and medium-sized firms will have some very good expertise that they can tap into that will actually probably suit their own organisational culture quite well.
And I suppose it really just comes down to, we don't need a complete systems change, really. That it's about building on what you already have, integrating that psych safety pragmatically, within an organisation's existing safety structures. So, I presume that would be the more flexible and sustainable way in order to do that, rather than to start from scratch. Would you say that that's a fair comment there?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the important part is starting from scratch makes it harder to bring it into the DNA. And I think some sort of incremental internal conversations with teams at all levels and that sort of co-design approach actually makes it part of the way we do things around here, rather than just another program that HR or management is trying to impose on the way we do things.
Absolutely. Go, Michelle.
So can I jump in there? Just picking up something Lucy said. I found this at the Victorian Bar that often you get more purchase and get more progress if you looked at what was happening already, and then you just find a way to kind of hijack it. That probably sounds probably a bit more violent than I intend, but you find a way to kind of latch onto that. So, for example, a tradition at the bar is called the open door policy, which was the idea of ensuring a sort of standard of conduct and of sort of sharing skills. And so you sort of take that on, and then you start talking about, not about well-being, but you talk about this particular policy. Another way, particularly when there was a bit of resistance of finding a way to take sort of an existing orthodox concern in importing it with sort of health and wellbeing content was to talk about leadership at the bar. And so there is this, the Victoria Bar is very hierarchical, and there's how the sort of junior members are sort of distinguished from the senior members is the amount of leadership roles they take. So a great way to sort of getting more senior barristers on board, and getting them enrolled almost unwittingly, in the process of cultural change, or at the time when I had very small children, I used to joke it was my way of hiding vegetables in pasta sauce. We talk about well-being, talk about culture, and about leadership, and that's so just taking things that work already, which are, as Lucy say, already part of the DNA, it's part of what they're used to. It's not so frightening, and you just put some well-being content in that, but also just quickly to pick up on that question and Lucy's response to some of the clues about risk within the workplace. Again, Kazarov provides a really fantastic example, because they talk about some of the ways that you can pick up on risk, and one method that immediately leaps to mind is exit surveys with staff. So really taking the time to get it, interviewing staff as they leave to get a sense of what's not working well, where the system's falling down, as well as I always think that not only is a disciplinary complaints a key indicator of what's happening within the profession, but also I think insurance claims, LPLC claims, I think again is another key indicator, because if you talk to anybody who's working within claims, they will also tell you anecdotally. I don't think it's something that they keep any raw data of, but they can certainly tell you anecdotally that it plays a key feature in the claims that they see that pass their desk.
Excellent. Do we have time for one more question? I'm just wondering. Maybe not. Probably not. I think we're right on. Very quickly, just to sort of to do a quick fire round of everyone. What are your hopes for the future of mental health in the legal profession? I'll start with you, Lucy. What do you want to do? I mean, I know you're from a family of lawyers, or you've got a lot of people around you. So what do you want to see?
So genetically, I say I'm a lawyer because I'm the black sheep in being a psychologist. But look, I just hope that people can enjoy being lawyers, and I can meet lots of happy lawyers, because I meet a lot of ambivalent and miserable lawyers who are not proud to be lawyers. And I think that's a really sad state of affairs. And I'd like to meet happy, proud lawyers in the future.
Wonderful. George.
I mean, Lucy's already put it so well. I mean, happy, proud lawyers globally. Try and really try and make a global impact.
Fiona?
Yes, I agree. We talk about wanting law to be sustainable and for lawyers to thrive, not just survive. And the other thing I'd add, I think, would be that people in positions of power and influence in the profession accept that their responsibilities are broader than just making sure they're delivering technically excellent advice to their clients. If we can see that responsibility taken on, I think we can see real change. And I do think that is starting to happen. You can also have cats at work. You might be able to see the top of my cat's head. Also very, very good for well-being.
Definitely. Couldn't agree more. And Michelle, to round off.
Well, I hardly endorse that. Plainly, there should be more cats at work. And I think part of that I would like to see is that that as lawyers, we really embrace our humanity more, and see that is not something we disassociate from, but actually see that really is key as part of what we bring to legal practice that's of real value.
Wonderful, and I couldn't agree more. Let's hope that we can use this opportunity to build on the momentum for change. That we do have the capacity, and look, the last 2 years have been testament to the fact that the legal profession has the ability to adapt and to change. And it doesn't have to be huge huge transformational change, but we've got the capacity to be able to make those assessments and really look and really speak through that meaningful consultation with our employees and within the profession, and in order to make these changes that we want to see for a sustainable profession. So I'd love to thank you all. I'm going to hand back the reins to Jason.
Yeah, no, thank you, Desi, for moderating that great discussion. Thank you for all the panelists. You did a fantastic job and really helped, I guess, shape the discussion, and hopefully given a lot of the people who are commenting like crazy in the YouTube chat, plenty to think about as they leave. So we're going to say goodbye to the panelists now, and we will catch them soon, hopefully. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
So Desi, you asked, the panelists, what were their hopes for the future of mental health, and you got them to give some words to sum up the great discussion you've just had. How would you sum up the discussion?
Well, I think, as I was saying, that we've got this just phenomenal opportunity right now, a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I think just as a result of COVID, we've really wound back, slowed down the pace, and had that inward looking opportunity to sort of reassess the systems, to really analyse, what potentially are those factors in the workplace that, affect our mental health. And I think, really acknowledging the fact that, we have been rather reactive in our strategy, that the current strategy is clearly not working as effectively as it could be, and that, this is the opportunity now to really sit down in our organisations and to assess those systems that are not working as well as they could potentially be working. Ultimately, and as a teacher of the practical legal training program and the students that I see, there's a lot of discussion that came out from it as well. But a lot of these problems in the legal profession, it's quite nuanced in the legal profession. It's not just an organisational issue. A lot of these issues really manifest early in university. So really trying to to assist students as well, to understand and get them in good stead for practice going forward. So to not only understand and to learn about personal resilience and coping skills as they're foundational to professional functioning as well, and personally as well. But really to understand that there are other systems at play, and that within the organisations, institutions and systems, that we've got that capacity to be able to drive the new narrative, that the law is truly a great place to work, and that it is inclusive, because a lot of the data that we did see suggested that we had a lot of room to progress in terms of inclusivity in our profession as well. So absolutely, look, I think it's a fantastic profession. I don't want to look back in 10 years time and have the same data and say be in the same place. I want to look back and say that this situation really was the catalyst for change, and for a more sustainable and thriving, flourishing profession. So that's what I want to see, Jace.
Just a low bar.
Well, that's it.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, Desi. And I know you had plenty of other questions actually you wanted to ask the panelists. I told you might need 5 hours for this.
Yeah, I know. See, the funny thing is, time management's never been my forte, but I've got to listen to you more in future, Jason.
What do you expect when you get a bunch of lawyers around the table?
That's right. I know. Everyone's competing for airtime. No, look, I think it was fantastic, and some really valuable, rich discussion. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity this evening.
Yeah, and thanks for, again, doing the heavy lifting, getting the panel together and asking the questions and moderating it so well. So to the viewers and the listeners, that brings us to the end of this live panel. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm glad to see heaps of people participated in the live chat on YouTube and on LinkedIn. This will be available immediately afterwards on the same YouTube URL that you're viewing the live stream on, and you'll be able to find it afterwards on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. So you'll be able to see that pretty soon after we actually end the broadcast in a minute. It'll also be a special podcast episode on the Psych Health and Safety podcast on Tuesday next week. So be on the lookout for that. If you can follow the LinkedIn page for Psych Health and Safety podcast, then you'll be able to be kept up to date in relation to what we've got on in terms of future podcast episodes and live panel events as well. So thanks again to Desi for moderating a really great discussion, and thank you all for attending, and we'll catch you next time.